Hello, I'm Maggie Batista. I'm a writer, a storyteller, and an intuitive. I am also an advocate for surfacing the voice of your soul. The voice of your soul is the calm and all-knowing wisdom and language that surfaces from within when we get quiet and listen. Now, I've shared a lot on how I surface the voice of my soul in many other videos, but I want to take a step back and share how I got to be here today, in this moment, feeling alive again and thriving and back in my body with my soul more intact and whole than ever. First, I want you to know that I'm a child of immigrants. I had a Honduran mother and an Italian-American father, and I am unlearning and relearning how to hold and heal the colonized and colonizer within my body every day. Part of that process has included trying to be as successful as possible in my career because I grew up with less and part of a line of people who lived with the barest of essentials. And to some in the outside world, I've been super successful. Over the course of my work life, I've launched some of the first internet startups. I've built engaged communities of millions. I've designed intentional brands, including an award-winning food retail brand. And I've operated hospitality businesses here and in France. I've written 2 cookbooks and multiple essays on how we relate to food and our bodies. But under the surface of my long and winding career, I always wanted to be a writer and a storyteller since I was a little girl. So in 2007, while still working for others, I got the spark to return to writing through food blogging and creating a food business that was born from my stories and recipes. And I did the food blogging thing for many years, and I think, again, to the outside world, everything looked pretty good. But you know, I think that it never felt as successful to me as it felt to others because I was living it. Eat Boutique started as a kernel of an idea the year that Twitter launched, and I had started spending a lot of time on the new social media platform. And I remember the day when I tweeted what I was eating for breakfast while working at a large internet company. And an engineer walked down the hallway and he peeked into my office and he said, "How's your muffin?" Now, he meant the muffin that I was eating, okay? But in that moment, the reach of social media became strange and interesting to me. And when I looked, I realized that hundreds of people were looking at my pretty mundane tweets. And so I wondered if there was a way to get back to writing. And with that, Eat Boutique was born. First as a blog and a recipe site, and then a food gift box business and a pop-up retail market. But it all started with an internal desire to do what I loved, to follow the call. Now, in addition to telling stories, I just love food from small makers, and I put them together in a gift box. So for my first offering, I ordered a couple hundred brown cardboard boxes and enough product to fill them, and they sold out in days. And then the Wall Street Journal covered my work, and they started selling out more consistently. And you know, while the business did get press at moments, the real growth was primarily through word of mouth and storytelling, through me sharing bits of my life, memoir style, and weaving in recipes. Now, through Eat Boutique, I was able to do a lot of things. I ended up hosting and designing food markets for 25,000 people, and at one point, my business had 40,000 followers, and these were people who wanted to know the date of my next market so they could buy food that I sourced. And then I was shipping food gifts for some of the biggest internet companies. And all of that is lovely and wonderful. But this bustling business was all happening out of my home. I barely slept because I was also working a full-time job, and I was a hardcore people pleaser, avoiding a lot of my pain and trauma through working consistently, overachieving, and trying to care for others. I think because I had followed my calling, what lit me up, the business had thousands of subscribers and my gift boxes were selling out. And eventually I went on to write 2 cookbooks and travel all over to talk about food. And by 2019, I was on the verge of opening a permanent retail space in Boston, something I had been striving for 4 long years. But unlike the ease of everything that had come before, opening the retail space was a real struggle, including up until a few days before I was supposed to sign everything on the dotted line. I had gone to the city of Boston to try to get their approval on the space build out, and they didn't approve it as is. They wanted me to spend more money to build out a second kitchen. And then I was already about to sign on a bank loan for close to $200,000. And then I was about to sign a long-term lease with a landlord on a space that was nice, but too small to fulfill on my original vision, what lit me up. All of these moments were happening over the course of 3 days in the spring of 2019. It had been 4 years of build-up through struggle and overworking and so much trying, so much force to line it all up. But despite the weightiness of it all and the curveballs that had come along, I was continuing to move forward until the universe sent me a wake-up call. I was driving on the road I always took to yoga class, which was one of my spiritual practices at the time. I was on a major road where there were no stop signs for me, so I could just keep going. But all the tiny streets that abutted the street I was on, they all had stop signs, so drivers needed to wait until the road was clear to cross. And I was driving past one such tiny street, and I noticed a car stopped at the stop sign. And that wasn't unusual. I normally would never have looked over to my right because I have the right of way. But this time, I remember looking over, and I remember looking in the eyes of the driver at the stop sign. And he looked at me in the eyes. We were very clearly looking at each other, our eyes locked on each other. And a second or two later, I just kept driving. And though we looked at each other, though he saw me, he proceeded to drive right into me. He saw me, and he just drove right into me, into the passenger side of my car. Now I pulled over, clearly shaken. Anatomically I was fine, but the right side of my car was totaled and took months to repair. He got out of his car and he was apologetic, and he was a young man and said he didn't know what happened. And the cops came and checked everything out, so I was able to drive away. But I remember calling my partner at the time, feeling a little bit bewildered. I pulled over to the side of the road to explain what happened because I was so perplexed and really upset about it all. And he calmed me down, and I went on to class, and I didn't tell anybody in class what had happened for fear that I would cry and not be able to stop crying. I just did my poses, but I could feel tears wanting to pour out of me because, frankly, it could have gone far worse. And after I got home and felt safe at home, I cried nonstop for what felt like a few days. And I sat with the reality that the city had said, "We need you to build a second kitchen." And I sat with the reality that I was about to tie myself to a loan the size of a small house. And I sat with the reality that I was about to sign a long-term lease with a landlord. So I thought about it, and then I decided to talk to my lawyer, because a lawyer is integral to signing all these things. And I explained how scared I was, that my body was frightened, and it didn't feel like good fear. And he shared an old Russian proverb with me about how the eyes are scared, but the hands keep doing. And I'm not entirely sure, but I think at the time it meant to me that the eyes are not only scared, but they're horrified. And the hands, or in this case my brain, still did its job compulsively. And I wondered about that. I wondered about which part of me was frightened and which part of me was just doing it. And I realized this fear that I was feeling, it wasn't a thrilling kind of fear. This was some inner part of me, perhaps my intuition, perhaps something else, raising a dozen red flags. Within days, I shut everything down. I walked away from my vision and turned inward to try to find what I really wanted my life to look like, how I wanted it to feel, what I wanted to do. And so while to the outside world my life looked golden, I knew that the years leading up to that accident had been filled with all kinds of trials, some that I didn't talk about much to anyone. Among them was the fact that my mother, a beautiful, energetic, chatty soul, who dressed like she was a forever teenager in hot pink Converse sneakers, well, she had died in 2017 after a long battle with ovarian cancer, a battle that I was caring for her through. And in sync with my mother's passing, I began experiencing pain in my body that my doctors couldn't figure out. And after doctors and psychologists and MRIs, the advice was to try alternative therapies. By this point, I had been meditating on and off for a few years and listening to a voice within that I didn't understand. And then I found Reiki and yoga, and those practices combined opened me up to a deeper dive into my own spirituality, through which I connected with this energetic guidance or internal wisdom, which I first called the inner voice, and I now call the voice of the soul. I had begun dabbling with the inner voice years before when I didn't know it as the inner voice, but I got serious about it, and I decided to study consciousness. And consciousness invites us to allow a witness or an awareness of some kind, and that awareness helped to take me out of my mind. But the awareness is still just a witness. It's a neutral party, but it doesn't espouse a vested interest. It simply notices. I knew that I was actually hearing another voice, and I was trying to understand it. And then I started learning about inner voice facilitation from Jess Lively. What she taught as the inner voice was so helpful and resonated with me, but as something a little deeper, as the voice of our most authentic selves, as the voice of the soul. The soul's voice has a little bit more of an opinion on you. It's invested in your thriving, in your joy, in your wholeness. And as I convened with it, I felt connected to everything, and I thought perhaps the soul's voice is all that is. Today, I know that the soul's voice is the kernel of you. It is the essence of you. It is the core of the core of the core, the center of your being. It is the ringleader of you. So if there is any entity that is in charge of the human, if you allow it, the soul's voice is the ringleader. The soul's voice will take in all the parts of you, and that means the mind, the heart and its emotions, your intuition, and even your awareness, the witness. And the soul's voice takes all that in and allows the most peaceful path to surface. So your inner voice allows a settling into your soul that allows you to choose you and drift toward joy. The joy that your soul knows or remembers that you came here to experience. And in the period right after the accident, my soul's voice had 2 words to say to me, and those words were pause and cozy. In fact, there was a 1.5 years where all I heard from the inner voice was cozy time. Now, the soul filled out that message over time. It asked me to go inward. It said, we want you to get cozy with yourself. We want you to show yourself compassion. We want you to rest. We want you to stop. And I had never allowed myself to stop. That's just not something that kids of immigrants do. I had never allowed myself to stop long enough to investigate what I wanted in any moment. And I never really grieved everything that had happened up to this point. I had just kept doing. By the time of the accident, I had lost my father. I had lost my mother. I had lost my dog. And also, I was losing this dream I had stood behind for years of a permanent storefront, a physical home from which I could offer my gifts. And also, I was losing some of the storybook qualities of the relationship I was in, realizing the fact that it was also expiring. And so it felt like a long time to hear the inner voice say pause and cozy time. But now I see it needed to insist on me stopping long enough to feel into whatever pain or trauma I had and to learn from it, to understand what I really wanted, and to see clearly that I was changing and it was okay to change. And as I went deeper into my spiritual practices, I found that when I stacked my practices, I could receive messages with such clarity from the soul and elsewhere. Oftentimes, I found the clearest messages from my soul's voice would come after a combo of meditation, Reiki, yoga, and breathwork. After those practices, I would receive a message from the soul's voice, or my guides, or even my ancestors. And then I started seeing ancestors in my meditations. Then a close cousin who passed came through, and then my mother came through. In fact, I remember my ex and I discussed divorce rather out of the blue on a Tuesday evening, and my sweet mother first came through on the morning of that day. She simply said, "You are fine. Remember, you are always fine." And then my guides started to come through much clearer, and I was able to name them and communicate with them. And so my soul awakening was a gradual process, but it was a self-initiated process from within. No one outside of me said, "Do this or do that to come home to you." My own soul's voice dropped in messages and helped me return to me. And because I'm a storyteller and a meaning maker, it also became clear to me that the accident and everything that led up to it, everything that had kept me from opening the retail space, had been in its own way a gift too. Shortly thereafter, a developer hired me to open a big multi-use market space in Boston. And that was a gift because they wanted me to help create something similar to what I had envisioned for my business. Now, it took me many months to be aware of the gifts, to make this kind of meaning. But I think I built that space to sort of get it out of my system, to have no regrets. So the accident was a kind of magic to me. It was a kind of call from without and within to stop going down an old path because a new path was forming. And I built out that marketplace and I realized, oh my gosh, I don't want to do this anymore. I had just been on autopilot. I was just doing it because it was something I wanted to do 4 years ago, because it seemed like the next step, but it no longer felt aligning. It didn't light me up in any way. In fact, it felt like an anvil around my neck. And as I was building out this new marketplace, COVID hit, and I saw the real magic. And that was that I was being protected from several years, many years, of not being able to get customers into the city, nor pay back a big bank loan. And finally, all that grasping and hustling and striving and trying was over. I left the trying portion of the program of this human existence, trying too hard, trying to change things. You know, we humans, we have this urge to control processes and outcomes and possibilities, and when I realized that my inner voice guided me in all situations, I stopped trying to change what was outside of me, and I started focusing on my healing within. I don't think I called it healing, but I started to excavate all the things in my life to remember my wholeness, to come home to me. And while I was doing that, I also exited a 20-year relationship, and I left my home of nearly 20 years, and I finally began to grieve the deaths of my parents, including the 13-year estrangement with my father, the person who I had looked up to most in my life. And I began to make space for what could be, for possibility. I closed a boutique and opened a new business focused on helping people to come home to themselves through the use of their internal guidance systems, their intuition, and the voice of the soul. I decided to call my new business We Are Magic Studio. And while it was a new business, it was really a sacred altar space that could hold all the parts of me in some way, that could allow the fullest expression of myself. I was thinking I would be a coach or guide, but when I could assign some meaning to it all, I realized that this magic within me had guided me back home. And if it could do that for me, I could tell stories to help others remember. Because all of us are magic. And speaking of magic, once we sold our home, I needed to find a new place to live. But like everything else, I didn't want to force a house hunt. So I surrendered the process to whatever you want to call it, the universe, source, all that is, you choose. I felt some ease that my next home, wherever it was, would arrive through my connections or through the magic of just living my life. And so I just did things that I would normally do, like meet friends and go to events and go to the sea. And I went to this one event where I struck up a lovely conversation with a very sweet woman. When she asked me where I lived, I said that I hoped to live nearby someday. And she said, "Well, I'm moving out of my place. Would you like to see it?" And when I walked up the 3 floors and came into this light-filled space with a skylight and a sliver of the view of the ocean and a beautiful tiny kitchen, I just started crying, tears of joy. And then she started crying because that was my place and we knew it. And it was so easy. It was a gift that was given to me. And this was something I was beginning to understand too, that I had been struggling against the current for so many years. But when I let go, when I surrendered, when I asked and listened and allowed, the universe or my soul or all that is connected me to what was meant for me. And remember when I said I was losing this dream of opening a permanent storefront, a physical home from which I could offer my gifts? Instead, I realized that the physical home I was seeking was in this body. And the more I rooted into it, the more I could unlock and offer my particular gifts. And that awakening of my soul leads me to what I do today, telling stories about intuition and transformation and magic and possibility, and how to listen and live guided by the voice of the soul, as much or as little as it feels good. So if you're waking up to the guidance from your soul, you're in the right place. Over several videos, I'm sharing a lot more about the voice of the soul, so go check them all out. And that's because it can change your life. It can help you remember your wholeness. It can help you come home to yourself. It can help you become your most integrated self. It can show you that all the answers for any question are always within you. And it will launch you toward adventure and a far better life than you can even imagine. And today, I live a life almost entirely guided by my soul. And if you'd like to hear more about the soul's voice or even hear messages from my own soul's voice, I invite you to join my community where I text you those audio messages and I answer your questions directly. Or you may wish to download my workshop on awakening your soul's voice. And there's even an option to have a Mayan soul astrology reading with me on the site. Until my next video, may your peace bring you all sorts of magic. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back very soon.